Thousands of years had passed since the battles between the two priest castes, which triggered the decline of Atlantis. The mysteries of Atlantis and its magic era had been forgotten for a long time. The invisible forces of the spiritual hierarchy and the Space Brotherhood secretly introduced a brotherhood to erect a chain of world empires. Entire civilizations have risen under the secret guidance and inspiration of this brotherhood. All the secret societies constructed the world's temples and cities, while God erected his temple, man, who had reached maturity in the playground of infinite experience. In ancient Egypt, the Brotherhood of the Snake had been in power for a long time, when arguments originating from the old conflict between the two brotherhoods of Shambhala and Agartha from Atlantis arose and flared up time and time again. This came to a climax in an argument between the Babylonian and Hebrew castes, in which both argued that they were the god race of the extraterrestrials. Thousands of years went by in which the same game of power and polarity opposites took place. Finally, the Hebrew Brotherhood on Shambhala's side won against an Aramaic branch of Agartha, with the help of Atlantean high technology, such as the Ark of the Covenant. During the entire time frame of the Old Testament, from the flood to Abraham and Moses, who received new guidance from God guardians, there was a brother war between the scattered Aryan castes of Atlantis with their ever lower descending consciousness. Thousands of years went by, and the Hebrew caste system with its tradition of lodges blossomed and freed itself from the high priest Egyptian power. Once again, the spear of destiny was taken from one culture and handed over to another. The Space Brothers secretly inspired the Hebrew priests and guided them in order to direct the newly chosen people of God. The Hebrew leadership role strengthened, and generations grew up under the influence of the deep mystique of the Hebrew initiation scripts and ceremonies of the rabbis. The prophets told the priests that they could foresee the birth of a new Messiah who would bring a new age. The prophecies also said that the Messiah would have incredible abilities and would be more powerful than all the world's kings. So the Hebrew Brotherhood knew for a long time approximately when the Messiah would be born, and they were very afraid to lose their spiritual and worldly powers. No wonder King Herod, when he heard of the birth of Christ, sent people to look for him. The Brotherhood feared that their power would be taken from them. By the time Christ started his work, visiting the scriptural scholars and making it clear to them that God's life was in the inner life of man and not in their dead scriptures, the end of the magical era of the Atlantean Brotherhood was not far off. From Atlantis' dark age to the rebirth of light, the path of becoming human was long and cruel. Through thousands of years, the Brotherhoods worked undercover in all cultures. Thus we can trace their path from Atlantis to Egypt, to the Holy Land, through Greece to Rome, and in all European royal courts. In recent times, they sent their leaders to new countries, such as America and Australia. Today, there are very few countries which have not been led from the outside by the old world order of the Brotherhoods. All 33 pyramid stones of the secret world conspiracy of the Illuminati and Freemasons are organizations of the imperialistic and materialistic pyramid, a manifestation of God's male hierarchy on earth, the spiritual powers of Lucifer, the carrier of light. During the time of King Solomon, God's messengers and wardens, the Elohim, entrusted the secret brotherhood, God's temple builders, to construct God's temple. The Freemasons and Illuminati, meaning the enlightened, and earlier called the Templars, had the difficult task of building God's temple. Symbolically, God's temple represents the human animal, half man, half beast, who has to be taught in order for him to live through every possible experience, both positive and negative, and continue learning through these experiences until he has transcended his lower attributes. These powers financed all wars and conspiracies, but also funded welfare organizations and extensive government plans of the Western world in order to offer human souls a playground for experiences. Now, for that very reason, we can understand the meaning of, I am the one power who desires good and creates evil. I am the one power who desires evil and creates good. Since Atlantis, all leading forces of Western religion and state systems have received partial initiation and helped to educate man. But now, the time has come when the temple has completed its purpose and the Elohim reappear to wake up all completed souls. Just as parents, who finally have to let go of their grown-up child so that it can be independent, on Earth, all social power systems since Atlantis have been led by the Brotherhood of the Snake, which in turn was guided by spiritual and extraterrestrial forces of the Guardians. In short, whether it be monarchy, capitalism, or communism, whichever strive for power and leadership has been spiritually influenced by the sun hierarchies during the Dark Age, and now represents the male materialistic forces. Of course, we have been guided by our religions and powerful leaders during the Dark Age, but these in turn have also been led by spiritual masters. Many people of lower grades of initiation do not even realize that extraterrestrial and cosmic influences of the sun hierarchies have been placed at the top of the pyramid of the lodges. During the Dark Age, sun hierarchies, the Illuminati, are the rulers, accomplished masculine forces, the builders of matter. In the last Golden Age, moon hierarchies, the Luminari, the accomplished feminine cosmic forces, ruled and brought matriarchy. The completed souls of the next cycle unite within themselves the sun and moon, which is symbolically a marriage of mind and matter. The union of man ego and woman soul within a human being leads back to immortality. In the future, the higher self will be a human being on earth. Christianity and the Templar Order. Each time it was written down, the true revelation of the divine was falsified, because every testament always represents an interpretation of that not experienced. This is how the world religions originated, with all their different sects, which strictly followed dead words to the letter, and were misled from generation to generation further away from the truth. After Christ's death, his words were wrongly interpreted also, and in parts purposely falsified. During the first century, great disappointment was felt within the first original Christian congregations, when part of the scriptures were falsely interpreted by the secret Hebrew brotherhoods, who stood on the side of the Romans. The Atlantean gospel of the life of the Essenes, Essener, which still includes the teachings of reincarnation, but excludes any interpretation of evil, led through the centuries to the strong division between heaven and hell. Peter, in his last days, recognized what had happened and asked to be hanged by his feet, symbolizing the world's confused situation. Back then, all his followers were only comforted by the knowledge that one day in the future, just before the return, they would be reborn in order to inherit the world.
To summarize what the Bible says about the coming of Jesus Christ, one could go to the words of Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 24. This chapter is often seen as a synopsis, you might say, of the Apocalypse or the writings of the Apostle John. And in this particular chapter, Jesus outlined very clearly how he will come. He will come visibly, personally, as a real person. He will come in the midst of noise, so it'll be an audible event, and a very dramatic, powerful and glorious event. He said he's going to return with all his glory, the glory of his Father, the glory of the holy angels. It will be a dramatic event.
For a long time, Christianity and the secret lodges of the Brotherhood had entered the European royal courts, where various knightly brotherhoods went to look for their roots in the Holy Land. Crusaders from all the European countries started on their journey to the Holy Land. Some of these knights had not been initiated by the Freemason Brotherhood, who had already at the time total control over the Vatican. They were searching for the truth because they disagreed with the activities of the head of the church. Especially during the 11th century, German and Baltic crusaders traveled to Syria, where an old master called the Elder of the Days told them the whole truth about the Atlantean brother war of the priesthood castes. The Babylonian stone plates revealed to them the destruction of the Aramaic Brotherhood by the Hebrew Brotherhoods, and the whole truth about the falsification of the gospel of the Essenes and Christ's message. This led to an immediate split from Christianity, and a new order of Templars was founded. After their return, the Templars used their newfound knowledge of Atlantis and built the Grail castles throughout all European countries. They introduced the money system and enjoyed a high reputation. Later, they were persecuted by the church. The old lodges followed, and the Inquisition began. Some of the knights came to Vienna, Heilig and Kreuz, where they established several monasteries and castles on sacred geomantic energy sites, where they kept part of the knowledge in scriptures. For centuries, part of the Templars' knowledge was hidden in and around Vienna. After the Inquisition, the old brotherhoods again seized power in a new disguise. Part of the Freemasons and of the Illuminati were directly evolved from this Templar Brotherhood. At the turn of the century, there was a monk in Vienna, a member of the Templar Order, who did not quite fit into the picture of the Brotherhood. He left the Brotherhood and the monastery near Vienna and took the name of Lance von Liebenfels. He later founded the new Templar Order.
Der Lanz von Liebenfels war vorher Ordensgeistlicher in
Previously, Lanz von Liebenfels had been a spiritual member of the Order of the Holy Cross and had written a work on a knight statue which stands on a monkey. This philosophy of one who stands on a monkey had an extraordinary impact on him, and this was also the core of the ideology.
Hat ihm also einen unerhörten Eindruck gemacht, und das war auch der Kern der Ideologie. Und zwar, meinte, dass dieser Ritter, der oben steht,
He believed that this knight who stands on top is a Templar, and that the Templars, the noble or heroic knights, were supposed to be in opposition to the ordinary humanity, which is represented by the monkey and which has to be crushed. Indeed, there would be a godlike human race and an animal human race. One should say in opposition to the animal human race.
Lanz von Liebenfels mingled his Templar knowledge with the Bhagavad Gita translations, which describe the battle of the gods of Atlantis. Later, he taught specifically that the Aryan race of the Brotherhood was the god-human beings, and that the Chandalan were the godless beings. They were involved in endless battles, as mentioned in the Indian mysticism. His worldview was that the Hebrew Brotherhood was the direct descendant of the godless, which suppressed the world of the Aryan gods during the Dark Age. Another interpretation was that the Nordic and Germanic people were the only descendants of the Atlantean Aryan gods, and that their origin could only be identified by their blonde hair and blue eyes.
Ja, also Lanz von Liebenfels war ja dieser grundlegenden Überzeugung, dass also die Weltgeschichte bewegt wird.
Lanz von Liebenfels was fundamentally convinced that world history arose from the battle between the races, between the noble, heroic and godlike human beings and the animal beings, and in between there were even some combination of both. Thus, through a cleansing process and through the slavery and oppression of the so-called lower human beings, a godly era would appear, if the race conflict was to be won, in Lanz's view.
Indeed, this is the root of racism. Since the time of Atlantis and its sinking, two castes of priests fought against each other, the Shambhala and Agartha, constantly changing into new shapes and new cultures. The earth and its eras may only be a mirror of this spiritual argument. In Austria, the old Austrian Templar monasteries are situated all along the river Danube. One of them stands in Branau, the birthplace of Adolf Hitler. We can only guess as to whether Adolf Hitler in his youth met Lanz von Liebenfels already at the Branau monastery, or whether he met him later during his years of study in Vienna. We can be sure that Lanz von Liebenfels initiated Hitler into the old Templar knowledge, the brother war of Atlantis, and into the falsification of Christ's message, the persecution of the Aramaic Brotherhood by the Hebrew Brotherhood, and all these secrets of the past. There is an indication that the first contact happened in the Branau monastery, where there is a copy of the Roman lance of the legionnaire Longistas, which Hitler searched for even more fervently than for the Ark of the Covenant. The lance of Longistus was supposed to hold magical powers, as it had been thrust into Christ's heart. The secret Atlantean teaching tells us that when the extraterrestrial gods fell in love with the still reincarnating human animal women, there was a war between the gods. The dissidents, the fallen angels, were banished to become humans. The last remains of the fallen gods from Atlantis were the kings of the Indo-Aryan castes and priesthoods. These Aryan priesthoods were dispersed by the incoming black races of the subcontinents, and the era of the gods came to an end. For thousands of years, the god-humans from the stars were incarnating into humans, while the Indian scholars were still fighting over which of the descendants of the Aryan gods belonged to the animal-human race. The initial root of racism, distinguishing between a superior and an inferior human, was thus revived, when, at the end of the 19th century, the search for the Aryan god-humans was taken up by a European esoteric elite. It was Nietzsche, with his superhuman and many other prominent writers, who drew the idea of the god-human from Atlantis out of the Indian texts. It was a few decades later that the secret esoteric teachings, mixed with the lost times of the Crusaders and the lost ideals of chivalry from the Germanic god legends, would influence a young man in Vienna. In Hitler's childhood, his father beat his mother while under the influence of alcohol. Thus, the desire to free his mother from evil as a knightly hero grew in the young Adolf Hitler. Already in his early youth, Hitler took refuge in the romantic world of Germanic legends, in which good wins over evil. This mysticism of the polarity of good and evil reached its peak in Vienna with the study of the esoteric literature of the Indo-Aryan battles of the gods. In these ancient texts, and in the first lectures of the contemporary authors, the worldview of the young Hitler was even more split into good and evil. In Vienna Men's Hospice, and inspired by these texts in solitary moments, Hitler forged his worldview. This worldview can hardly be reconstructed, yet the world of the god-humans from Atlantis and their fall through evil influenced him so much that he lived in his own fantasy world. When Hitler came across the books of Guido von List, and later of Lance von Liebenfels, the fire to free the world from all dark forces was unleashed.
So according to Lance von Liebenfels, originally there were people with blonde hair and blue eyes. They were godlike. They came from somewhere in the universe, and amongst them were the animal-like humans, particularly the so-called monkeys. According to Lantz, the races commingled insofar as the blonde and blue-eyed women united with the animal-like human beings. This is how the mixed races appeared, and these were called the little monkeys or Chandlan. Indeed, this comes from the Indian tradition. These animal-like beings and so on, in the whole world history, threatened the culture which the blonde and blue-eyed people had created, and which they still create. So this conflict is the fight of the animal-like, the lower beings against the so-called noble, heroic people. This leads to the necessary destruction of the lower beings. This program of destruction is the ultimate goal. It is indeed a form of apocalypse, in which the lower beings will have to be cast out, and the blonde and blue-eyed beings will survive.
In der also sozusagen die Untermenschen ausgeschieden werden sollen und die Blond-Blauen allein sozusagen überleben.
With Hitler's view to save the world from evil, the catastrophe was already preordained. In the text by Lance von Liebenfels, we can find the inspiration ground of all racist teachings of the time, and Hitler embraced literally all of these ideas. Thus Lance von Liebenfels spoke of a purebred race of Aryan people and the reviving of the noble qualities of the gods, and of the end solution of getting rid of the inferior races in order to establish again the god-human race, blonde and blue-eyed, as the superior race. But Hitler was not the only one to read the teachings of Lanz von Liebenfels and his paper Ostara in Vienna. There were many different personalities from various organizations who later came together in order to pull on the same side and to establish the idea of the new superior race. Ludendorff and Dietrich Eckart already subscribed to this racial publication. Strengthened by his interpretation of esoteric material, perhaps already a member of the Templar Order, Hitler launched himself into the First World War. He may have already made contact with Ludendorff before the First World War as an equally esoteric-minded friend. His chance to convince all that he was the German savior who would lead the battle against all injustice on earth came a few days after the beginning of the First World War in Munich, where he spoke up after the liberation battle against the communists. For a long time, he kept secret his esoteric knowledge and his membership of one of these esoteric sects. It was only when he came to power that people started to think about the idea of a blue-eyed race superior to all other races. A new Atlantean god was to be bred again, who would embody the godly qualities and psychic abilities. And the animal human of the rest of the world was to serve the super race. Due to the esoteric studies, he lived in the very personal world of his own imagination, where he saw the normal human being as degenerate and the archetype of the Atlantean legends of the gods as the standard to be re-established.
We are quite sure that Adolf Hitler was an honorary member of this order. He knew Lanz von Liebenfels personally. That is what Lanz told me and two other friends. He said Hitler had visited him in 1909 and previously bought the Ostara, but a few magazines were missing, and Hitler had thus asked Lanz to give him the remaining issues. Lanz did so. He gave them to him. And this means that Hitler knew the complete Ostara. He probably also knew the book published by Lanz in, I think, 1905, with the title Theozoologie, or Of Sodom's Monkeys and the Dream of the Path of the Gods.
Encouraged by his occult knowledge, he decided to lead the world into the 1,000 Years Empire as a messiah and savior in a final victorious battle against evil. Through the influence of drugs, he became a medium and naturally saw himself as the carrier of the lost qualities. He took the idea of a 1,000 Years Empire from John's Revelation. However, Hitler was not alone in his dream of establishing a Germanic empire with re-emerging god-humans from Atlantis. The Tula Society of the Germanic Order and the Armenian Order of the 19th century, which met in the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich, had the same dreams with one difference. They saw the Freemason lodges and the Illuminati as the supreme evil.
Not many people know that the Tula Society was a cover organization of the Germanic Order. This Germanic Order was created around 1912, and the Tula Society appeared later. Theodor Fritsch was the driving force behind the Germanic Order, and he, of course, was the mastermind of German anti-Semitism. At the beginning of this century, he had already conceived that the Jews, and the organization which represented the Jews, which embodied Jewish culture, namely Freemasonry, in his opinion had to be fought against, preferably by an organization of the same caliber, indeed with a secret lodge. That is why the many anti-Semitic associations of the time, as well as the readers of his magazine Hammer, became united in the Reichshammer Union in 1912. The Germanic Order was created as a secret sister organisation. Their principles were identical to those of Freemasonry, but it fought against its opponent with Germanic ideas. Finally, a work of conspiratory nature emerged. The Germanic Order would only take on trustworthy people of Germanic nature. To that effect, very detailed prescriptions were applied in order to achieve the desired result. People had to be preferably blonde and blue-eyed. They had to have a secure income. They had to have status and, of course, have internalized the appropriate ideas. The Germanic Order did not develop very well in the First World War because many of its members were involved in the war and membership dwindled. The first disagreements occurred, and in 1916 the Germanic Order was split. One branch of the Germanic Order renamed itself and became the Germanic Order Pilgrim to the Holy Grail, out of which the Thule Society emerged later. Rudolf von Sebottendorf contacted the Grand Master of the Order, Hermann Paul, and both decided that Sebottendorf would build up the Bavarian provincial branch of the Germanic Order. Indeed, he did so. He recruited members, and in August 1918, the great inauguration took place. The Germanic Order was initiated in the headquarters, that is, in the Four Seasons Hotel in Munich, with an inaugural lodge. Shortly after this came the well-known events of the end of the War Revolution. From then on, we can speak of the Thule Society. The Germanic Order then renamed itself with the cover title Thule Society in order not to divulge the conspiratory secret alliance and to hide amongst other popular organizations, thus having a greater range of action.
Adolf Schicklgruber, Hitler, the Enlightened, wants to release the world from Satan. As it happened, shortly after the First World War, young officers of the German army were introduced to an esoteric lodge called Thule. This lodge uncovered the secret world conspiracy of the Illuminati. These officers were extremely excited when they discovered that the war they had just lost had already been predicted as a conspiracy during the 19th century in the secret scripts of the wise men of Zion. The secret scripts of the wise men of Zion, the Illuminati, quoted, "We are the one force which finances all parties and wars until mankind gets weary of wars. We are the one force which brings power to the powerful, whether it be kingdom, aristocracy, communism, or capitalism. And because they are indebted to us and they are tired of fighting, we will introduce a new world order to control all finances and national debts. Mankind will have to rewrite history when it examines who financed the Napoleonic Wars, Lenin's Communist Revolution, and all political parties of the First World War." Towards the end of the 18th century in Europe, especially in Germany, a new movement was founded which was interested in deeply spiritual matters. The origin of mankind and all the secrets of Atlantis were of particular interest. These spiritual groups were inspired mediumistically by invisible masters who taught European scientists visiting India and Tibet. The foundations for these secret esoteric teachings were the secret writings of Petrova Blavatsky. At the beginning of the 19th century, various esoteric groups, such as the anthroposophists of Rudolf Steiner, were directly issued from these teachings. They mentioned the coming of a new age, which would be preceded by a great battle between good and evil. The teachings by the invisible masters of Shambhala were mixed by the esoteric followers of the time with other religions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and John's secret Christian prophecies. many newly founded occult sects discovered that there were esoteric lodges before them, such as the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and the Illuminati, who were pulling the strings of world politics. The new occultists of the turn of the century were waiting for the new golden age to arrive, and like various sects today, believed themselves to be the chosen ones. They would inherit eternal life and the 1,000 years empire after the apocalypse and the return of Christ. At a time of turmoil, many groups wished for one enlightened leader.
Shortly before his death in 1923, Dietrich Eckart is supposed to have said, "Follow Hitler. Hitler will dance. I have composed the music to his dance. I have given him the opportunity to get in touch with them. Do not accuse me. I will have had more influence on history than anybody else." To get in touch with them, what did he mean? In essence, and theoretically, it meant that Dietrich Eckart gave Hitler the possibility to contact the powers of Agati. He convinced him that he had to complete the work of Agati. It meant the demise of Shambhala represented in the international Freemasonry.
In 1912, von Symbottendorf founded the Germanic Order in Bad Aibling, out of which emerged various occult ideas, which would later trigger the Great Tragedy. They saw in the old Freemason and capitalistic lodges the personification of the evil enemy. In 1918, after the German defeat of the First World War, this Germanic order in Munich merged with many other groups into the Thule Society. They also invited recently discharged officers to attend their meetings. At the meetings, they discovered that the financial lodges of the Zionists had merely used them on the battlefields. One can only guess that they saw the personified Satan in both the Freemason and the capitalistic lodges who had financed the war. Thus, the Second World War was already pre-programmed. For many years, people had worked on the illusion of ridding the world of a Satan and on the triumph over evil in a last battle, making way for the 1,000-year empire and the return of Christ.
The Thule Society naturally had a large number of prominent members in its ranks, also people who later became famous in National Socialism. Of course, Rudolf Hess is particularly well known to have been essentially working in the Fighter Alliance in the Thule Society. Hans Frank, later Minister for Justice in Bavaria and Minister without a portfolio in the Third Reich, was also one of them. Alfred Rosenberg, the so-called chief ideologist of the Nazi NSDAP, who later wrote The Myth of the 20th Century, was also a member of the Thule Society. We must not forget one man who did not live to see the Third Reich, but who had a striking and important influence on Hitler, the writer and poet Dietrich Eckart. Dietrich Eckart essentially became famous for his revised version of Peer Gynt, which was then performed. He was also known as a poet, author of some significant fighter songs of the Nazi NSDAP. This man strongly influenced Hitler. He clarified and gave direction to the confused ideas which Hitler already had in Vienna. Hitler and Eckart came together and often discussed different political questions. Eckart managed to direct Hitler's antagonistic opinions of Marxism and capitalism into a unified anti-Semitic view. Most importantly, Eckart provided Hitler with important connections within the society. He helped him to become courteous, well-mannered, and introduced him to the refined people who were able to help him financially.
Ihn bei den feineren Leuten eingeführt hat, ebenfalls Finanzen beigesteuert hat. Und Eckart war ein Mann, der
Eckart was obviously not a member of the Thule Society, but was in close contact with the leading figures of the society. One must imagine all this like a spectrum, in which individual association memberships were not so important, but where the people from the different organizations and parties repeatedly met, where there was overlapping in the membership, but where in a particular period, that is specifically in Munich at the beginning of 1919, crystallization centers increasingly emerged. One of them was definitely the Thule Society, and all the important people who met at the time essentially fought against Marxism, met at the Thule Society or in its sphere of influence. Out of the Thule Society emerged the idea, as Sabotendorf, the founder of the society, declared, that support for the national cause should also come from the working class, and not only from the middle classes and bourgeois circles. These ideas had also spread to others, as for example the engineer Paul Tafel, also a member of the Germanic Order. Sabotendorf appointed one of his associates, the sports journalist Karl Hara, to create a political working circle within the Thule Society. Hara did so, and happened to meet Alfred Drexler, with whom he worked closely. In January 1919, Hara and Drexler founded the German Workers' Party, which had its origin in Drexler's Free Workers' Community for Peace. One can say that the original building of the Nazi NSDAP was laid by the Thule Society. Hara was a Thule brother. Drexler was also moving in these circles. And the initial people of the DAP all came from the Thule Society circles.
Weil Hara war ein Thule-Bruder, Drexler verkehrte auch in dem Umfeld und die ersten Leute, die in der DAP Einfluss hatten, waren aus dem Umfeld der Thule-Gesellschaft.
The Thule organization secretly made great plans to release mankind from the financial conspiracy. To them, the Illuminati, Freemasons, and Zionistic financial connections represented a world dictatorship which had to be fought and defeated. However, it would still take a while until they found a political candidate who would represent them in power. Because of the deep Christian and occult nature of the Thule organization, which meant something like the Society for Research on Atlantis, its members searched in all ancient prophecies for when the Dark Age would come to an end. In his last days, Jesus revealed something about the days to come. These old secret prophecies revealed by Jesus to his apostles said that the beginning of salvation would spread from a country behind large mountains, where a great leader by the name of Elijah would be born. Jesus turned around while talking and pointed to the Roman legionnaire Longistus, who was a German mercenary. As a result, the German lodges believed that this secret gospel of John revealed that the land was Germany, the large mountains being the fortress of the Alps, and that the mentioned leader was already incarnated. He would free the world through the final battle in order to initiate the 1,000 years empire of peace and the return of Christ. This is how the Thule interpreted Christ's speech. In about 1,000, plus not quite 1,000 years, you will be reborn together with Elijah to free the world. He meant the 2,600 Essene followers who were Atlantean descendants. The actual prophecy was that light workers who had taken on his work would be reborn in approximately 2,000 years, together with Elijah, who at the time of Christ was John the Baptist, in order to herald the imminent return of Christ and of life itself, and to announce the end times. In this secret revelation, it was mentioned that the power would be taken out of the hands of the Hebrew Brotherhood. Jesus meant that the spiritual power would be given to another country. The German Thule Society still identified itself with the role of world savior which could free the world of evil. This idea became the heart of its anti-Semitic teachings. When this occult sect thought it was freeing the world of Atlantean Freemasonry through the Second World War, it expected part of this secret prophecy to be fulfilled. The brother war of the two priesthood castes of Atlantis was reenacted in the Second World War through the Tula Society. The members believed themselves to be Christ's followers, fighting the battle for freedom from the Hebrew lodges. Yet these souls of the Third Reich were the other brotherhood of Babylon which had lost power, the brothers from Agatha, who in their previous high culture in Babylon had lost against the Hebrew priesthood. The Second World War was a continuation of the Atlantean Brother War. It was karma, which is the greatest mystery, revealing that in fact the Jewish and the Germanic roles had emerged from a common Atlantean past.
The story of Agati and Shambhala is also impressively described in a novel by Russell McLeod, The Black Sun of Tashilonpo. The novel is about the battle between these two forces. And in one part of the story, a 91-year-old former SS in Tibet tells a journalist pursuing the story how these two forces behave. He relates how Agati and Shambhala and their legend have intervened in real history.
Und erzählt ihm, wie diese Legende in die Realgeschichte eingegriffen hat.
Therefore, the Tula Society was a precursor to the original cell of the NSDAP, in actual fact, an extension of Agati. The successors of Sebottendorf, Dietrich Eckart, and in his trial Karl Haushofer, initiated Hitler into this legend. They made it clear to him that what he represented in the National Socialism was the work of Agati, and that Agati fought against its opposite, Shambhala, which at the time, and even later, had primarily gathered forces in the Freemason lodges and in the organizations of the Jews.
In Freimaurerlogen und in Organisationen des Judentums.
That is the story behind it all.
Churchill and Roosevelt were the leaders of the Freemason Brotherhood, and Hitler was the leader of the Tula Society and the New Templar Order. In the prophecy stating that at the time of the return of Christ, the head of the serpent would be crushed, it was not meant that the Freemasons and the Illuminati would be violently destroyed. On the contrary, it meant that through the return of the inner cosmos, the Christ powers would depossess the world powers through the overcoming of polarity in man. When the Eagle, that is the Space Brothers, has landed, there will be no world powers left, because from then on, there will only be ascended and conscious beings on Earth. They will have lived through the resurrection and will be connected to their inner truth. The return of Christ, thus, is the revelation of the planetary spirit in man, out of which he can read the whole truth himself. And thus we can perhaps only guess that the apocalypse, to a great extent, will take place in the mind of people and only partially in the outside world. The true light children and Christ followers were to be born much later, and their mission is more healing of the earth through the overcoming of polarity than the waging of wars. The Tula organization believed then that the new golden age had already started, and that Elijah and the great Atlantean souls had already been born to release the world from the dark forces. When Dietrich Eckart von Sebottendorf and his followers consulted several spiritual mediums, the name of the young officer Adolf Hitler was mentioned to them through the astral world.
The fact that Hitler was to be a kind of Messiah who would free the world from the Jews and from the dark forces is indisputably the direct experience in National Socialism. He himself surely also had this experience of being the chosen one. He repeatedly spoke of providence, by which he was guided. At the end, he was not happy with providence, and he said that Providence could not take responsibility towards the German nation of Germany losing the war. This is indeed a strange thing. But before that, he undoubtedly felt called upon, that is, chosen by Providence, to play a fundamental role in the world history and to free the world from the Jews and thus from the lower human beings. Dietrich Eckart was somebody who had a strongly anti-materialistic disposition. Actually, he drew his worldview from the spiritual. He was influenced by Schopenhauer and by a medieval mystic by the name of Angelus Elysius, who lived in the 13th and 14th century. He was inclined towards spirituality in literature and in his own experiences. He rejected materialism. He saw the people who were gaining influence in Germany and those in power as symbols for materialism. On the one hand, they were the Marxists, and on the other, of course, the liberal bourgeois and the capitalists.
Und auf der anderen Seite natürlich die bürgerlich-liberalen und der Kapitalismus.
These spiritual ideas by which Eckart had been strongly shaped were surely passed on to his pupil, Adolf Hitler.
Adolf Hitler's occult past already began during his years of study in Vienna. He read Nietzsche's Superhuman, Übermensch, studied the secret teachings of Helena Petrova Blavatsky, the secret revelations of John, and regularly attended the lectures of Guido von List. He was definitely a subscriber to the occult magazine published by Lanz von Liebenfels, which already glorified the racist madness, the male sun cosmologies, and Aryan culture. He found the climax of his spiritual ego in the legends of the Nibelungen sagas. In Vienna, his desire already took shape to release the world from dark forces as the Germanic Messiah. The first meeting between the Tula organization and Hitler took place when the Tula organization, together with the officers of the Volunteer Corps, drove the communists out of Munich. Hitler was informed about his specific destiny and firmly believed himself to be the reincarnated leader from Atlantis. The aims of this sect were obviously kept silent. Hitler was worshipped as Elijah. His salute, also called Ave, is a greeting of the gods. The swastika was the reversed symbol of Atlantis. If the swastika is turned anti-clockwise, it means the resurrection of souls, the ascension into the Golden Age. Turning the swastika clockwise means the descent of souls into the Dark Ages. Germany Awake was written on every banner, the sentence supposedly an awakening call towards a new Golden Age. The Tula organization wanted to bring about, by force, the resurrection of Atlantis and the 1,000 years empire foretold by Christ. No wonder they used the sign of the descent into the Dark Age. Adolf Hitler was adored as a savior by 50 esoteric groups and brought to power. No one could imagine that he himself was one of the last masters of the Dark Brotherhood of Atlantis, who would lead it to the dark side of occultism. For the first time during the modern era, an esoteric sect came to power, with all its divisions and various branches. The sole objective of this sect, who practiced secret occultism and mass magic, and lived in its own reality, was to take power from another esoteric sect, which has held the world power in its hands until this very day, the Freemasons and the Illuminati.
When the international Jewish financial structure is again successful in plunging the nations in Europe and outside into another world war, then this will not be a victory for the Jews, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe.
Surely it is no coincidence that both the Germanic and the Freemason lodges, which both believed themselves to be chosen by God to lead mankind, were in fact the misleading seducers rather than the chosen ones. And looking behind the scene, one will discover that both forces were in fact dictatorship, his battle against his own inner darkness. The dark side of power within us and the world receives strength only when one gives it an existence in consciousness by evaluating and rejecting it. Consequently, transformation can only take place within a person and never on the outside. The exterior world only changes when changes occur on the inside.
I'd like to use as a reference point, though, the Mayan calendar and the Mayan prophecy. And in the Mayan prophecy and the calendar, we have 13 heavens, which of course are controlled by the 13 lords of light. And each one of those heavens lasts 52 years. If you take the 13 heavens and multiply that by 52, you end up with 676 years of ruling by the lords of light. Shortly after they cease, then of course in comes the lords of darkness, and each one of those two are 52 years duration, but there are only 9 of them as opposed to the 13 lords of light. So we can see that light still prevails. Nevertheless, they were very necessary to stimulate growth within the human race and here upon the planet. And each one of these lords of darkness played a personified and a, you might say, a strict application for the growth of mankind. Now, if you go back in history, and if you were to trace it back 468 years, and of course take each one of the 52 increments of the 468 years, you will find out that something great and stupendous happened during that time. Now, the last great Lord of Darkness was none other than one we knew as Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was a divine instrument. Adolf Hitler played his role well. He wore the dark hat as opposed to the white hat. If we were to relate this to the Indians, and I've worked with the Indians for 22 years, they have a very simplified understanding of these things. For instance, they have a Lord of Light called, for instance, Quetzalcoatl. And then they have a Lord of Darkness called Pakal. Now, in their mythology and in their understanding of the Lords of Light and the Lords of Darkness, these two are brothers. They are twins, in fact. And they love one another very much. But they play separate roles. As the Lord of Light, Quetzalcoatl, ends his reign, of course, he turns to his brother and he says, well, now I've taught them all I can. I want you to go in there and test them and see how well they've learned what I have taught them. Well, in comes the Lord of Darkness, and in this case, we're talking about Hitler, to see how well we had learned in the past from the Lords of Light. As we know, Hitler was a metaphysician supreme. As he was a boy, he studied studiously for many, many years what we know today as esoteric or metaphysical things. He also, in addition to the many understandings he had of Virgil and many other powers which were, of course, used by the ancients, he had a morbid fascination with the spear of destiny. And that was, of course, the Longinus spear that pierced the side of Christ. Hitler knew that anybody, whether it be the Lords of Darkness or the Lords of Light, should they have that spear, they were almost certain to win the war. Now, he wanted that spear for so long, and there was one in a man by the name of Rudolf Steiner, who lived here in Germany also, and he and Hitler both had a morbid fascination for that spear of destiny. Later, we know that Rudolf had to flee for his life because Hitler felt that he would get the spear and he wouldn't have it. So, when we talk about Hitler, we're talking about, in my understanding, a divine being. I can remember 3 years ago in Frankfurt when I said before a large audience that Hitler was a divine being, when of course I thought they were going to stone me. But I let that sink in, and finally I said he was the last Lord of Darkness. And after I had explained it to them, then of course they accepted it.
Therefore, every exterior revolution is already doomed in advance, because the masters of revolution themselves will later become the dictators of this world. The worst that can happen is the rule of a spiritual leader who is striving to gain world power, but who only understands half the truth and has not yet surrendered his ego to divine guidance. At that moment, an occult superego will be born, where only one individual visualizes him or herself as God superior, and all others are again inferior beings. The occult war which started with Atlantis reached its climax during the Second World War. The New Templar Order saw the Illuminati and the Freemasons as the Antichrist, whereas the Illuminati and Freemason orders perceived the New Templar Order and the Nazis as the Antichrist. Today it should be clear to everyone that God is inside of every person. However, to perceive ourselves as being the chosen ones, be it because of a religion, a race, nationality, or color of skin, inevitably means the beginnings of a human tragedy. God's people are not to be recognized by their color of skin, by their race, or by their outside appearance, but by the virtues of love, wisdom, and power, which they have inwardly united. All races came once from the stars and are God's people because they all carry the seed of God in themselves. The animal human, by conquering his animal features through thousands of lives, has developed into the real human being.
Were there any contacts between the Third Reich and extraterrestrial races? My very long research into the terrestrial secret societies has proven to me that basically almost all the secret societies on the planet were established in the first place to be the low-key, low-profile interfaces between extraterrestrial races or intelligence races with even higher level and our civilization. In my research, we've discovered that the Germans were in contact with at least a dozen alien races, all of them loosely grouped under one philosophical, political, religious program. And not only that, but that actually this grouping of extraterrestrial races were in their turn subcontracting for even higher levels of, let's call them celestial management structures. But we have discovered witnesses, a lady in Australia that worked shoulder to shoulder with extremely beautiful looking extraterrestrials in an underground base in Germany. She was a British spy, a Commonwealth spy in this underground base, and she has told us incredible stories about the close cooperation of the highest echelons of the German secret societies with